Leichenwäsche, Rainer Maria Rilke. Sie hatten sich an ihn gewohnt, doch als die Kutschenlampe kam und brannte im dunklen Lutzwig, war der Unbekannte ganz unbekannt. Sie wuschen seinen Hals, und da sie nicht von seinem Schicksal wussten, so lagen sie in anderer zusammen, fortwährend forschend. Eine musste husten und ließ schon lang den schweren Essigschwamm auf dem Gesicht. Da gab es eine Pause, auch für das Zweit. Aus der harten Bürste, klampften die Trumpfen, waren seine große, gekrampften Hand dem ganzen Hause beweisen wollte, dass er nicht mehr dürste. Und er bewies. Sie nahmen bei Betreten, ihr Lager jet mit einem kurzen Huster. Die Arbeit auf, so dass sie den tappten, ihr krummer Schatten in dem stummen Muster, sich wand und wollte wie in einem Nitze, bis dass die wuschenden Duende kamen, die nach im vorhanglosen Fenster hammen, war rücksichtslos. Und einer ohne Namen lag bar und reinlich da und gab Gesetze. Corpse Washing by Rainer Maria Rilke. Translation by Edward Snow. They had grown used to him, but when the kitchen lamp came and burned restlessly in the dark draught, the one unknown there was utterly unknown. They washed his neck, and since they knew nothing of his fate, they made up another one between them, all the while washing. The first had to cough, and left the heavy vinegar-soaked sponge lying on his face. Then there was a pause, while the other rested. From her hard brush the drops kept falling, while his terrible cramped hand tried to make the whole room see that he no longer thirsted. And he succeeded. With a short cough, as if embarrassed, they took up the work more urgently, so that on the wallpaper their hunched shadows writhed and twisted in the mute patterns as though in a net, until the washings came to an end. The night in the curtainless window frame was pitiless, and one without names lay there bare and clean and issued laws.
This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, I have Mark Burrows, one of the world's leading experts on Rainer Maria Rilke, a German language poet from the late 19th, early 20th century, and the conversation will begin in a moment.
Black Cat by Rainer Maria Rilke. Translation by Edward Snow. Even a ghost is like a place your glance bumps into with a sound. But here, when it encounters this black fur, your strongest gaze will be dissolved. The way a madman, when he is in fullest rage, pounds into the blackness, stops short at the sponge-like padding of a cell and drains away. All the glances that have ever struck her, she seems to conceal upon herself, so that she can look them over, morose and menacing, and sleep with them. But all at once, as if awakened, she turns her face straight into your own, and you unexpectedly meet your gaze in the yellow amber of her round eye-stones, closed in like some long-extinct insect. Schwarze Katze, Rainer Maria Rilke. Ein Gespenst ist noch bei einer Stelle, dran dein Blick mit einem Klang stoßt. Aber da in diesem schwarzen Felle wird dein starkes schon aufgelost. Weil Entobender, wenn ihr in Wolster, Raserei in schwarzes sanft, Jallings Emben behentinke Polster, eine Selle aufhört und verdampft. Alle Blicke, die sie jemals treffen, scheint sie also an sich zu verhellen. Drobe drohend und verdrossen, so schon und damit du schelfen. Doch auf einmal kehrt sie, wie geweckt, ihr Gesicht und mitten in das deine. Und da triffst du deinen Blick in Gleam, aber ihre runden Augensteine und wartet wieder, eingeschlossen bei ein augusterbenes Insekt.
Rainer Maria Rilke, German language poet, is the subject of this show. I have Mark Burrows. He's a professor and Rilke expert. As I usually like to do, I want to give my guests a few minutes to give a little background about themselves and what relates specifically to the topic at hand. So Mark, welcome, and if you could give a little background about who you are, where you come from, and what Rilke means to you.
Well, thanks, Dan. It's always wonderful to talk about Rilke, who's been a passion in my own life since I was really a kid. I started reading Rilke as a teenager. I suspect that's the way many people stumble on Rilke. And it happened that somebody had given me his letters to a young poet, which is just the kind of thing that gets at the questions that late adolescents, young adults are thinking about and asking. What's the meaning of life? What does love mean? What's sex about? How do we deal with betrayal? How do we understand our vocation as writers? What does it mean to be a writer? What does it mean to be a poet? And I think at that time I already was writing poetry. I was thinking about what it meant to be a poet. I never would have used those words or dared to imagine that I was myself a poet. But something about the way Rilke addressed the question of life and art was arresting. It just took me to the depths of what I felt in a kind of inchoate way in my own life, and that's where my experience of Rilke really began. It continued then, reading poems first in translation, and as I began to learn German in those teenage years, I quickly found myself turning increasingly to the original, the poems in the original German, which are exquisitely beautiful, dazzlingly difficult on some levels. Rilke wasn't writing to be understood, but he was writing to be experienced. In fact, in his single novel, if you can call it a novel, he called it a kind of prose poem or poetic prose. The notebooks to Malte Lloyd's Brigge, he says that poems aren't feelings, they're experiences. And I think that's very profoundly true with Rilke's own poetry. You experience them long before you begin to understand them. And I think that's one of the gifts that poetry in general brings. It doesn't ask us to understand first and then come to an experience. It brings us an experience in language, in image, in feeling, in intuition, and only then does it lead to some kind of an understanding. So my first experiences with Rilke's poems began in my late teen years and continued through college. I began to translate Rilke's poems in part because there were, at that time, we're talking about the 1970s, there were some translations that were popularly available, but he was hardly a household word. Robert Bly did much in the late 60s to put Rilke on the English readers' maps. And it really continued from there. Now there are translations of most of the poems, and of the more important poems, many translations available in English. But I began to translate Rilke because I wanted to share his poems with friends, and that led over the years to my beginning to publish my own translations of his poems, including most recently the volume Prayers of a Young Poet. These are early poems from Rilke that eventually came to stand as the first part of the Book of Hours, a well-known book, and available in many different translations into English. So that's where Rilke began for me. I went on to study literature, German literature, at university, and then did advanced graduate degrees in theology, always really at the edge of poetry, looking at mystical literature and particularly at mysticism as a kind of poetic form of knowing. And I've spent the last 35 years of my life really working at that, the nexus between mystical literature and poetics or poetry. Rilke would never have thought of himself as a mystic, although he had transcendental experiences. He was part of a kind of spiritualist movement that gripped Europe and the United States at the turn of the 19th to the 20th centuries. So he dabbled in those kinds of things, but he felt that his own writing was a kind of spiritual gift that he received himself, often by what he described as dictation, and that he wished to share with others. He was a loner in his life. He was, as many artists are, someone who needed to have a certain amount of solitude. One of his favorite words both in the novel, the Malta novel, but also in his writing, is Einsamkeit, very difficult to translate into English, but probably the best translation is solitude, often translated as loneliness because it can mean loneliness as well. Einsamkeit, if one is einsam, you're lonely, but the aloneness, the solitude that comes in aloneness for Rilke was fundamental to his work as an artist. I felt that in my own way as a writer, and continue to gain an appreciation from Rilke about the need for a kind of retreat in order to engage one's own life and engage the world. And that certainly is the gift of Rilke's writings.
Well, let me start, and in this first segment, we'll do about 20 minutes or so, and I want to talk sort of, before we get specifically into poems in his writing, just talk in broad strokes. Just so people know, I am speaking to you, and you are in Germany. You teach at a university there. What is the university, and what is Rilke's place within the German literary canon? Because I mentioned before we started Wallace Stevens, and if I could name names like Hart Crane, these are names that people who know poetry in the U.S. are specific, but they're utterly forgettable, that no one knows these names, big names in America. Is Rilke someone who is a cultural icon that, you know, has name cachet to your average German today?
Well, I teach, that's a good question. I teach at the Protestant University of Applied Sciences in Bochum, Germany, a city in the northwest part of Germany, not too far from Dusseldorf. I would say that in some ways Rilke is known by any German student who comes through the high school system would have encountered Rilke along the way. Probably a poem or two. As with American students, they might have read The Panther or The Swan or The Carousel, poems from his middle period. Very few would know much more about Rilke than those few poems. And in fact, in some ways, Rilke has had a stronger draw in the North American context, I would say, than is the case in Europe. There are some specific reasons for that. When I arrived to do my graduate studies in Germany in the late 1970s, the cultural context was very politically charged. This was a period when Americans were deploying a massive number of middle-range nuclear warheads in Germany during the Cold War era. And among the students, at least, with whom I had contact, and generally at the universities, there was a strong anti-American feeling, but there was also a suspicion about literature that had no political edge to it. And Rilke would have to fit into that category. He's not a political poet. It's not that he never thought about politics. He wrote voluminously in his letters about issues of the day, but he tended to think about culture in an apolitical way, not an anti-political way, but an apolitical way. He was after something more deeply human than the realm of politics, as important as that certainly is for human beings. So I would say that, is Rilke known here? Of course he's known. Is he read? He's read, he's studied. If you ask people in Germanistik, in the field of German studies, German literary studies, they would quickly say that he defined in his later writings German modernist literature. One might even say expressionist literature, although I would use that guardedly because it's a rather vague term. But his last great outpouring, 2 cycles of poems, the Duino Elegies and the Sonnets to Orpheus, really steered German literature in a distinctively new way. A kind of similar influence, I would say, to the influence of Wallace Stevens in the United States, who developed a form of writing that is distinctive and that shifted something fundamental about the literary landscape in the U.S.
You had mentioned to start the Malta Laureate's Briggs novel or prose poem, and also Letters to a Young Poet. And I read those after I had read the poetry. I was a poet myself initially, and when I read the 2 prose works, the thing that came to me was the old saw about poets are not good as prose writers and vice versa. If you read the poems of Eugene O'Neill or you read the poems of Herman Melville, they suck. And if you read Democratic Vistas or Walt Whitman's prose, other than this recent novel they discovered of his, it's like he said it's so much better in poetry. And when I read Letters to a Young Poet, I feel like I'm reading the German precursor to Jonathan Livingston Seagull. And I'm like, how the hell did this guy write, the new poems and the Duino elegies? What is your take on his prose versus his poetry?
Well, it's a good question. And first of all, on the Letters to a Young Poet, these are 11 letters that he wrote over a several-year period. He was only in his mid-20s when he began to write them, to a young poet, Franz Kappus, who wrote to him and said, I want to know if I'm a poet. Can you help? Can you look at my writing and tell me if I'm a poet? And Rilke wrote back and said, no, I can't do that. No one can do that. You have to find that out yourself. And as I said earlier, I think that the Letters to a Young Poet has a powerful draw on a kind of late adolescent, early adult mind and heart. It's not a book I would recommend to adults who are going through some kind of a deep spiritual crisis or longing to understand something profound about human experience. But in that kind of 18 to 25 year range, which is exactly when the letters were written, Rilke was in his mid-20s. He wrote them to a young poet in his late teens. They have a powerful effect. So I'm not surprised that you found them somewhat uninspiring or didn't move you deeply. You probably came to them later in your life. The novel is a whole different beast. And let me say just a few words about it. Rilke spent almost a decade working on this, and it is not a conventional novel. I must admit, it took me 10 attempts to find my way into the novel, because it is a series of journal entries, really. Notebooks isn't quite the right translation for Aufzeichnungen. Probably, which is Rilke's title, the Aufzeichnungen, is more like an artist's sketchbook. It's more like a sketchbook, although these are journal entries written by a young man who was in Paris at the time and was having a psychological breakdown, as in fact happened to Rilke during that decade, his first decade of experience in Paris. So much of the novel comes right out of letters he was writing at the time to friends and associates, and simply moved over into this quasi-novel form. As I say, it's dissatisfying reading if one expects a classic novel with a beginning, a middle, and an ending, with character development, with multiple characters. There are multiple characters in the novel, so-called novel, but mostly they're characters within the narrator, which is Rilke himself. So it's a very complicated piece of writing to find one's way into. There's quite a bit of interest now in Germany, in German studies departments here in Germany, in this novel, which is intriguing because in a way it's a kind of anti-novel. That is, he ruptures the traditional form of the novel, which was very strong during his period, during his lifetime. He's an older contemporary of Thomas Mann, who defines a new genre of novel during his lifetime in creative work. Rilke is just before that tremendous outpouring of new novel writing. And I would say that the psychological dimensions of that novel are part of its lasting appeal, not a wide appeal, not a broad appeal, but an appeal to those who are looking at shifts in the literary landscape in Europe at the turn of the century. So it's different than the poetry, clearly. These are a different genre. He never went back to, he didn't try to write a second novel. And in fact, writing this one exhausted him completely. It depleted him. It was part of a kind of, I would almost say, a kind of psychological journey of his own to come to terms with himself. And if you've read the novel all the way through to the end, what happens in the very last part is that Rilke tells his own version of the familiar parable of the prodigal son. And in that parable, the son returns after having squandered his inheritance, living a loose life, and finally finding himself among the pigs in the pig pen trying to survive, and comes home to the father, who opens his arms with forgiveness, with celebration that the lost son has returned. Rilke turns the whole parable on its head and says, well, actually, the son didn't want to be understood. The son didn't want to be embraced with forgiveness. The son was the prodigal son. His prodigality was the measure of his distinctive genius, his artistic passion. And in fact, what would mute that would have been to be received back into the domestic fold and simply becoming part of the family again. This suggests something about Rilke's rather tortured experience of domestic life, both as a child himself, growing up in a very difficult family. We would call it a broken family today. A psychologically overbearing mother. His parents separated when he was a young boy. And his mother outlived him, actually, by quite a few years. Rilke died at 51. They had a very difficult relationship with his mother, and eventually he fell madly in love as a young man in his early 20s with a woman 14 years his senior, a quite distinguished writer, philosopher, and novelist in her own right, Lou Andreas Salome. A relationship that lasted their whole life, but not as a love relationship. It only lasted about a year and a half before she broke it off. But he immediately then married Clara Westhoff, a sculptress. They had one child together, Ruth, who became the executor of Rilke's literary estate with her husband after his death. They only lived together for a number of months, less than a year, about a year, and then decided mutually that they could not devote themselves to family life and to their art. The child, Ruth, was raised in her earliest years by Clara's parents in Bremen, the nearby city, to the artist community where they were living. But again, the novel suggests something about his more than ambivalence, his diffidence toward domestic life. I suppose today we would say he was a kind of a free spirit in these ways, and that's certainly true. But it helps understand the novel, because the novel is his coming to terms with the restlessness, the anxieties, the burden of helplessness that many creative people feel, the sense of being misunderstood by the society around him, and the sense of alienation from so much of what seemed to characterize the kind of public life that surrounded him, the life of working, of building, of creating externally. For Rilke, that was all actually of little importance. For him, the building that we were given to do is an inner building. It's an inner journey. It's an inner discovering. It's an inner creating. And of course, that's not something that most people are called to. And I would say the novel, Malte, is a novel that most people will not find their way into, because it's so too far from their own experience. But for those who are at the edge of the kind of urgently interior life, as Rilke was from his early years until his death at the age of 51, it's a novel that might have some appeal.
I want to get back to his wife as a sculptor, and also Rodin when we talk about the new poems, his relationship with Auguste Rodin. But I want to talk, you mentioned Robert Bly and translations, and in the early 20th century, right after his death, when he became known in the 30s and 40s here in the English-speaking world, there were mostly translations by guys, I think, like C.F. McIntyre and a few other people, and they were mostly fairly rigid, There wasn't a sense of music. Bly came along and he brought a bit more metaphor, although musically they're still clunky. Then by the late 70s, 80s, Stephen Mitchell and Edward Snow came along, and they're sort of the two dueling Rilke translators into English now. Some people prefer one over the other. Mitchell tends to add a few words and images here or there. Snow is a bit more minimalist. Talk to me about Rilke's emergence as a big influence within the English language poetry world, if indeed you agree he is. Was Bly key in that? Was it MacIntyre and the earlier people, or did it have to wait for Mitchell and Snow?
No, it's a wonderful way of phrasing it. I do think that Bly had an enormous influence to popularize Rilke, to bring Rilke's voice to a much wider audience. And part of it, the early translations of MacIntyre, of Leishman and Spender, these were mostly the late poems, which they consider the great works. And these are the poems that are most difficult for people to make any sense of, Germans or English readers who are reading in translation. But that's true of Rilke in general. In general, he is not a simple poet to translate. And in part because he understands that language is about more than description, or certainly a kind of informative dimension, that it's evocative, that it has an intuitive dimension, that it is the margins around the language, the music. You mentioned the music of language is so important for Rilke, but it's the what surrounds the margins of metaphor for him that's so crucial. And there it was Bly who I think sensed that himself as a poet and gave voice to that in a marvelous way. I mean, there are some of Bly's translations that, when I was doing my own translation of Rilke's Book of Hours, the first part, it was very hard for me to resist simply saying what Bly had said, because the words were so emblazoned in my memory. That said, they're quite free. They're quite expressive. And I think, in a sense, it's a lesson in translation to read the versions of Rilke and try to find one's own place within that chorus. The magisterial book by William Gass, published maybe 20 years ago, the late William Gass, he died last winter, reading Rilke, a rather unpresupposing title, I think. It's really a marvelous cultural reading of Rilke, but also a kind of a probing of how difficult it is to render Rilke into English. And he does it with a tremendous sense of his own importance, and that was who William Gass really was. He was a magisterial figure, but also with a good sense of humor. I was touched reading through that volume again some months ago, that he often gives his own translations and then criticizes them. And in fact, anybody who tries to translate Rilke will inevitably do that, whether they say they're doing it or not, because there's no point where you're ever finished translating a poem, any poem of Rilke's. There are some that I'm sure for this translation I spent 60 hours on a 12-line poem over a period of years, trying to make sense of it, trying to capture the sense as well as the music of the poem, as well as the meaning of the poem. But when I say meaning, I mean meaning guardedly. And you're quite right that if you look at more contemporary translators, Edward Snow, whom I prefer to use with students who are coming to Rilke for the first time, is a minimalist. He stays quite close to Rilke's syntax as much as one can in English. He stays quite close to the images of Rilke, and he doesn't attempt to try to rhyme in the way that Rilke did, particularly in his earlier poems. And there's something to be said for that. I must say I probably am closer to Snow in that regard than to Stephen Mitchell, because Rilke felt that the words themselves and the images that he used were important. And for poets who use rhyme, who use end line rhyme, there's a very simple way of understanding what happens. If you've ever tried to write a poem with rhyme, what you discover is that your choices are limited. Once you choose an end line sound, the vowels or consonants of a word at the end of a line, there are only so many things that can rhyme with that word. Rilke felt this was one of the great goads of poets, particularly in his first 20 years of writing, because one discovers things that one wasn't expecting to know or to say. And let me say that again, that if you're trying to create a formal poem, which is heavily rhymed, end line, end syllable rhymes, end word rhymes, you have to use things you might not have thought of using. And for Rilke, this was essential to the creative life. He would never have put it quite this way, but it was what we would today, the psychology was just at that point, discovering the unconscious. I mean, Rilke is a contemporary to Sigmund Freud, to Carl Jung. And the unconscious is the domain where the poet's work takes place in a profound sense. Rilke never would have said it that way, but his poetry breathes from that place. And in point of fact, I think it's one of the marks of his genius, that he continued to allow the unconscious, the energy of the unconscious, to give shape and form to his writing.
Well, let me pick up, and this first half I want to end with two questions, and then we'll talk about the poem specifically. You talked about the hardness of getting into Rilke, and I don't know if I would agree that it's hard. One of the things that Rilke's poems, when you read them, especially the later poems from the new poems on, they seem to slide so easily into the unconscious, and it's because of some of the word choices. And there are some, when I've read translations of different poets, for example, I've got 4 or 5 books of Pasternak's poems. 4 of them you couldn't tell from the translator there was a great poet, but that 5th one, bam! On the other hand, you have someone like Osip Mandelstam, who he seems translator-proof. I mean, you could get the dumbest ass going, and he couldn't screw up a Mandelstam poem. And I think Rilke is closer to Mandelstam, because even when I look at a C.F. McIntyre translation, and it doesn't have the musicality, it doesn't have all of the softness and sort of, I don't know, hue, if you will, there's something interesting about the little feet that stamp out a flame, or there's something about the sliding of the swan on the water, or there's something about the panther as it gazes, you what's it looking at, that you can't really just fuck up. And so do you think that that's one of the hallmarks of Rilke, is that I know when I read something, I analyze it first analytically, but if you come back to me 5 or 10 years from now, I may not remember what the novel or the film is about, but I'll remember the impact that it had on me. And that's the way it is with Rilke's poems for me.
Yeah, you've said a lot. Your descriptions are, I think, especially true of the so-called new poems, the Thing poems, what he himself called the Ding-Gedichte.
Yeah.
And those came in part because of his encounter with Rodin. He was Rodin's personal secretary for 2 different periods in the first decade of the 20th century. And Rodin initially found Rilke somewhat annoying. He found him too lost in his own importance, too removed as an artist. And that may have been the kind of inevitable response of somebody who in his art form was very concrete. He's dealing with visible forms. He's creating things. He's sculpting out of clay. He's creating bronze cast models and so on. Rodin told Rilke to go to the zoo and to look at the animals and to look at things, to go to the museums, to look at things. And some of Rilke's most memorable poems from that period are precisely that. The panther, the swan, which you mentioned, the carousel, I mentioned these earlier. These are visual feasts. They're feasts of close, long looking at a single animal or a single thing. The famous poem, celebrated poem, on the archaic torso of Apollo, which ends with the great line, "You must change your life." But he's looking at something that can't change at all, in the sense that it is a statue that has been badly maligned. It's lost, the legs are gone, the arms are gone, the head is gone, and one has simply the torso, but imagining from looking at the torso what isn't there.
Yeah.
And that's the only way to really make sense of that last line. It's not a moral line or some kind of existential line, you must change your life. It's to envision one's life, not in terms of what one can see, but in terms of what isn't there, or is no longer there, or isn't there yet. So, long answer to your question, I think there is something very concrete about those poems, but they're distinctively different from the early poems, much more lyric, and from the late poems, which are much more existential and much more disjoined, because he's writing in a very different form, and he's writing with a very different intent in the elegies and in the sonnets. Perhaps we can come back to those in a little while.
Let me just end this first segment with a comparison. Even though William Butler Yeats was certainly more political, he served as a politician and whatnot, I've often found writing-wise the Rilke and Yeats careers similar. They both wrote these the romantic early poems that, compared to their later work, just don't come close. They both had this turn around the same ages in their lives where they did something new. And they both seem to get better with age. Rilke had periods where he wasn't writing, whereas Yeats seems to have been more active. But do you think Yeats is a good analog for a poet, someone who had a similar poetic arc throughout his whole life, in terms of growth at least?
Well, Yeats is a good example in that he saw himself as a poet from an early age and devoted himself single-mindedly to the pursuit of his own vocation as an artist and as a poet. And Rilke did the same. And he is one of those rare people who was able to fund himself as a poet through his art and through the benevolence of friends. He lived a rather, not a lavish life, but when he stayed in hotels, which was often because he was really homeless for his almost his entire adult life. That is, after his short period of living with Clara in a kind of domestic household in Vesta Vede, near Worpswede in the north of Germany. From that point on, he never really had a permanent place of his own. He stayed in hotels, he stayed in apartments. For the last years of his life, he was in what he called the Castle of Musot, a kind of a strangely cold building with very little external character, a kind of tower, well, all that was remaining of the so-called castle. But it was that sense of, for him, living, as with Yeats, I think, the intensity of the creative life did not involve external circumstances. The difference between Yeats, I think, and Rilke is also an important one. Yeats was very tuned into traditions in Irish culture, and Rilke was far less interested in Germanic. He was not German. He wrote in German. He comes from. He was born and raised in Prague, part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire of the late 19th century. He was born in 1875. Dies in 1926. He's often called a German poet, which is simply wrong, but he was a German language poet.
Yeah.
But the Germanic traditions did not influence him in the way that they did some other contemporaries writing in his time. He was trying to find a form that was a modern form, a modernist form, particularly in the middle and later period of his creative work. And in that regard, they're quite different from each other.
I want to talk about some of the work of Rilke, and I want to talk about one thing that people rarely talk about, and I have a collection of his French poems, and Rilke may be one of the few poets I've ever known who's written a great poem in more than one language. And there's, I think, about 4 or 5 of the French poems that are great poems. I don't think they're as great as the greatest German poems, but I think you could make an argument, at least from the translations I saw. Just briefly, if you could, tell me, how did he start writing in French? Was he raised bilingually, and or was it just dabbling in French?
Well, it's more than dabbling, but he immersed himself in French, and when he moved to Paris for the first time in the early 1900s, he was not the kind of person who would have sought out other German writers, although there were other Germans living in Paris at the time, or people who spoke German and wrote in German. He went to Paris to find something new. And we could almost call it a kind of soul pilgrimage, going to Paris. He found Paris shocking, disturbing, overwhelming. He had never really encountered a city like Paris, which was one of the great burgeoning, growing cities of the early 1900s. And it simply overwhelmed him. But he immersed himself in the literature, in the French literature of the time, and became acquainted with key poets writing during his time. He met with them in salons. He made French his own language, and I think that's something that was somewhat unusual. There were many Americans who came to Paris in the 1910s and 1920s, and for the most part, they created an enclave of American artists. But Rilke never fell prey to that, and it wasn't his interest. So he more than dabbled in French. He became adept in French, not simply the poems, but a voluminous outpouring of French letters. So French became, for him, a language in which he discovered, I think, something, an expressive form that he could only know about in French. And that's true for anyone whose work as a writer involves, as it must, the blessings and the burdens of a particular language. The finitude of language means that there's something that we can only find out about when we leave our own language, our mother tongue, and embrace the mother tongue of another culture. I would say, in fact, that one never really is at home in one's own language until one discovers what it is to be at home in another language. Mm-hmm. And that was certainly the case for Rilke.
Well, we spoke of the new poems and Rodin earlier, so if we have time, we'll come back to that. So let me focus on the 2 later sequences that he's probably most known for, rather than individual poems, and that's the Sonnets to Orpheus and the Duino Elegies. Let's go with the elegies first. Most people hear an elegy, they think, well, this is going to be, written about so-and-so. This wasn't like, poems that were written, for certain people, was it? Or was it more or less just an intellectual undertaking about the idea of death and its many incarnations? Or
well, it's a good question. It was the whole. Rilke began these poems in 1912, so they were finished in a very intense period in the winter of 1922, so 10 years later. He started them in 1912. He broke off after writing 1.5 of the elegies. He started again in 1914. The war came. It was a tremendous disorientation for Rilke. It eventually led to his being conscripted into the Austrian military service, and he was sent to Vienna to write basically propaganda in the war office there. And the writing didn't cease, the creative writing didn't cease, but it came to nearly a standstill for a several year period. Poetry. He continued to write letters, he continued to write reviews, but the poetry came almost to a complete standstill. In 1922, when he commences to write the elegies, death is a big image here, but it's not death as the ending, it's death as a part of what life means. And in one of the most well-known letters he wrote toward the end of his life to his Polish translator, Ulewicz, he tackles this question and says in a very passionate sense that until one understands that death belongs to life, death is not the end of life, death belongs to life, death and life are woven together. Until one understands this, one is hopelessly at ease in the world. And that's really the theme that shapes the elegies. It's the kind of mingling of death and life, the power of death as a creative power in one's experience, and the power of life to shape how one lives with death. So these 10 great pieces that then came very quickly over about a month period. As I mentioned earlier, the elegies together with the sonnets define modernist German writing as probably no other single monument of writing has done in the 20th century.
Well, let me talk then about the sonnets to Orpheus briefly, because there's, going back chronologically, you think Romeo and Juliet, King Arthur and Guinevere, and then Orpheus and Eurydice are sort of the substrate of the idea of doomed love that is with us now, even through Hollywood films and Bollywood and all this stuff. Yeah. What was the attraction to the Orpheus-Eurydice myth for Rilke, and is the sonnets to Orpheus, is that really something that explores the myth or the impact of the myth through, and beyond?
It's another good question, and not an easy one to answer. Let me take a stab at it. The cycle of poems, 55 poems written in about 8 days over a 3-week period. So they were written over 3 weeks, but he was really writing only for about 8 days of that 21-day period. He later claimed that he heard them, that they came as a kind of inner dictation. Not that he heard them in an audible sense physically, but that he heard them within himself. And indeed, there's really almost no other way to make sense of how this remarkable epic-making sequence could have been written any other way. He dedicates them to the memory of a young woman whom he met as a girl during his years living in Munich, who lived her whole life suffering and eventually died. She was a dancer early on, and when she could no longer dance because of her illness, she began to find other forms to create art, painting and writing and so on. And this shook Rilke to the core. The young girl's name, Vera Ukama Knoop, became a kind of, not inspiration, but a kind of presence in his life. And so what is the myth, the story of Orpheus and Eurydice? What role does it play? One has to think very clearly about how he entitled these poems and how he shaped them. They're not the sonnets of Orpheus, they're the sonnets to Orpheus. So what kind of sonnet would one write to Orpheus, this half-god who devotes himself to trying to save the woman he loved, Eurydice, who's fallen into the netherworld at death? And most people will know something of the story. He is given permission to go into Hades to lure her out on one condition, that he may not turn and look at her, because if he turns and looks upon her form, he'll lose her forever in eternity. And so he takes his lyre and he plays music to lure her out, and at the last minute stumbles and turns, and she's gone. And that, for Rilke, that moment of stumbling, of a love so deep that it gives everything to save the beloved, but stumbles in a moment of disbelief. It's that moment that prompts these poems. So he's writing them to this mourning, M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G, the mourning Orpheus, who's lost the one thing he loved the most. And so it has this double layer. It's the myth of Orpheus, but it's also the story of this young woman, this one-time dancer whom Rilke admired greatly and was profoundly attracted to for her artistic passion, who eventually succumbed herself to death. And that's the story that's woven through these poems. So again and again, one senses in the poems themselves Rilke reaching toward Orpheus with his own creativity, trying to find a solace, trying to find a kind of a voice honest enough, anguished enough, restless enough to reach this somewhat tortured, heroic figure of Orpheus.
And Mark, I wanted to ask a more general question. If we had a couple of hours, we could go more into depth on some of the poems and whatnot. But since I have limited time, I want to get this point out. You mentioned sort of the divine inspiration that people would associate with things like the sonnets to Orpheus. And certainly, I talked earlier how I found a certain mawkishness to some of the letters to a young poet that remind me of Jonathan Livingston Seagull. On the other hand, when I read some of the great poems, from the new poems through the elegies, through the sonnets to Orpheus, it seems to me that Rilke goes beyond religion. It's almost as if he's offering art as a counter-structure, a cultural counter-structure to religion. And he seems to me the ultimate art for art's sake writer and poet, and is one of the reasons I think he's such a great writer. And, you often hear, oh, all art is political and this bullshit, all art is truth, all art is beauty. And it's like, no, art is good enough. Art is good enough for its own sake. It's a thing that in and of itself has value. And to me, Rilke seems to be the absolute sine qua non of that idea. Am I wrong? And what was his relationship with religion?
A difficult relationship with religion. Let me start there. He was baptized and brought up as a Catholic, Roman Catholic in Prague. He did what most aspiring writers did in that time, which was to journey to Italy to discover the art and the culture of Italy. There he found a kind of Catholicism quite different from what he knew in Prague, which was a somewhat, I would say, well, I won't make a comparison, but the kind of churches he discovered in Florence and in Venice during that time were churches that were opulently beautiful, that were full of gold, gilt. These were the churches that had been redone in the Baroque age or built in the Baroque age, if they were newer churches, more recent churches. He described in one of his notebooks from that first prolonged stay in Italy, he described God as a rather poorly kept work of art. And that vision of God never really left him. He felt that the ways in which God had been handled by religion domesticated all of the passion, all of the darkness, all of the explosiveness, and the the creative and destructive power of the divine, that took all of that out. And Rilke found that unconscionable. In fact, in one of his poems from the Book of Hours, he describes the God of the churches as a God who's become like a managed refugee, somebody who had to leave home, forced to leave home, and is living in a kind of an exile, handled by others, and badly handled by others. And so in one of those poems, he says, God is just trying to get as far away from humans as God can possibly do. And I think that's a kind of literary description. He's not writing as a theologian. He's writing as somebody who felt that religion had been so domesticated. And so the Germans have a wonderful word, verharmlos. The potency was completely taken out of it. The capacity to harm, to damage, to even destroy had been taken out of God. So God is this kind of vapid bourgeois figure who was, for him, unpalatable. So first, that's on the religion side. He went from Italy several years later, having fallen in love with a woman of German-Russian background, Lou Andreas Salome. He went to Russia for the first time and fell in love with religion there. He was so taken by orthodoxy, by the Orthodox Church, particularly the monastic churches that he and Lou visited together during Holy Week in 1899. And there he discovered what he came to call the dark God, the God in the roots, not the God who's up in the tree trunks, like in the Baroque churches, full of light, full of fruit, full of opulence, and so on, but the God who's damp and dark and hidden. And it was that hiddenness of God in his experience of orthodoxy that was so compelling. And you have to think, he was visiting, at a time before the Kremlin. One thinks when he was Kremlin today, you think of the center of the communist government, or today the quasi-capitalist government of Putin.
The gangster government. The gangster government.
You could say that. The gangster government. At that time, the Kremlin is the old city of Moscow, the ancient center of Moscow, and it's full of churches. I think there are 9 monastic churches or secular churches in the Kremlin, and they were active when Rilke was there. So the first thing he does when he gets to Moscow is to visit with Tolstoy, who was not that interested in Rilke. He was much more interested in Lou Andreas Salome, a stunning beauty and a remarkable woman who spoke Russian and came from a Russian-German family. But he warned them. He said, 2 things you should be careful of. Stay away from the peasants and stay away from the church. It's just superstition. And so Rilke, being a rather contrary person, decided that was what he would do. He began to dress himself up in sort of peasant clothing already during that visit, which must have looked ridiculous to some of his Russian friends he visited, Pasternak and others, Pasternak the painter and others. And he immersed himself in the church and fell profoundly under the spell of the kind of monastic orthodoxy that he experienced. The first part of the Book of Hours, which is hard to tell in the later version he published, the first part is written from the vantage point of an old Orthodox monk and icon painter. And when he published it later as part 1 of the Book of Hours, all of the notes that he originally wrote, they're included in my translation. It's the only version we have that includes the kind of explanatory notes, the short autobiographical notes that Rilke includes to talk about the old monk and what's happening as he's writing these poems. So it's a long way of saying that he has a complicated relationship with religion, a quite critical relationship with Catholicism, which he felt was largely a superstition and childish, the religion of his mother, he detested. But he's drawn to what he envisioned as the dark religion of monastic orthodoxy. So that's a long answer to the question about his relationship with religion. And there's the second part to your question. Remind me.
Oh, I was just I was just asking, did he think art for art's sake that it was a construct?
Okay. That's an interesting way. I would probably disagree with you on that point slightly, because for him, art was for life's sake, not for art's sake. He didn't create art just to create art. There's an urgency for Rilke. He's trying to communicate. And when I hear the phrase art for art's sake, it's a kind of art that emerges in the 1920s and 30s that has no regard for the audience. Rilke was very concerned about his audience. He wanted to have readers. He was intent upon reaching readers. He felt that art had an urgency for the sake of life. So art for art's sake, in the sense that he wasn't writing to become popular. That certainly wasn't the case. But he was writing with an urgency of communicating. And there I would qualify a little bit the art for art's sake. I would say art for life's sake for Rilke.
Well, let me end this interview with a final question. I want to talk, we're recording here in the year 2018, and I want to talk about sort of the current state and the future state of Rilkeana, if you want. I mentioned Walt Whitman recently had a manuscript of an early novel discovered. What do you think the next century or so of Rilke studies will entail? Is there a work out there that's, you know, sort of the white whale that we know he wrote that might surface at some time? Or is there a work that has been previously overlooked that you think that needs more study and someone needs to come and translate it correctly, say?
Yeah, good question. I'm not a fortune teller or a future teller. I would say that Rilke will remain, I think, a vital presence on the landscape, the literary landscape of those who are seeking to live their life with deeper inner intentionality. And in the kind of world we live in, increasingly fragmented, increasingly threatened by kinds of violence that have always been present but seem completely unpredictable and completely capricious. Someone like Rilke, I think, will have an ever greater interest or offer himself to those who are trying to find some way through the dark labyrinth that we think of as late modernity. There won't be a new book discovered of Rilke's. He worked so closely with his editor during his lifetime and published pretty much everything that he wrote in terms of the poetry was published, including the uncollected poems. So in that sense, there won't be a great discovery in a hidden drawer of poems that he's written. There are every year letters that are discovered that he wrote. He wrote voluminously. He wrote several hours a day, letters, correspondence, at a time when that was quite normal. Writers devoted themselves to writing letters, and usually that meant writing 2 drafts of letters. Rilke spent a large part of every afternoon writing letters, and that's almost a lost form. It is a lost form. People don't write letters anymore, and what we call emails are not letters in the classic sense. Something different happens when one sits, or in Rilke's case, stands. He had a standing desk. He wrote standing. Stands or sits and puts a pen to a blank piece of paper and makes decisions about what one is going to say, to write to another person. That's something very different than writing even a serious and intentional email, which has a kind of evanescence, an unreality. It disappears. And in fact, in my email sender, there's a little sound as the email is sent off through cyberspace, and in a fraction of a second arrives on the computer screen of somebody I've sent it to. All of that for Rilke would have been dismaying. The immediacy of communicating was not his interest at all. And I suspect, Dan, that with time, we may find our way back to those sorts of lost habits, cultural habits, like letter writing. When I get a letter, which is very rare these days, it's a moment of startlement and rejoicing. And usually these are only old people older than I who continue to write letters. When I ask my students in their late teens and 20s if they've ever received a letter, most of them say no, they've never received a letter. They've never even received a card. And if they've received anything written, it was from a grandparent, either a grandfather or a grandmother. But most of them don't know what that experience is. I'm not sure that they will be redeemed by writing letters, but I do suspect that there's something about these older forms of communicating that we have lost to our own detriment, I would even say to our peril, and that something vastly important about our own cultural legacy is on the edge of extinction. And that concerns me. Rilke isn't the only one who can help us here, but his letters are a treasure, and there are continually new letters that are being discovered. Now they fill some 20 volumes, and there will be more volumes to come. In terms of something, I rephrase your question a little bit. There won't be an undiscovered work of Rilke's that will come to light. I don't believe that's possible. There will be discoveries of what we already knew in ways that may startle us into new levels of recognition. I think of someone like Stephanie Dowrick, an Australian Rilke scholar, whose book on Rilke, In the Company of Rilke, is a stunning expression of that, of what it means to live patiently with Rilke's poetry, with his prose, above all with his letters, and to allow them to give shape to one's own inner life. And I wouldn't say spiritual life, I think that word is too overused, but the interior life that is a landscape like the landscape of the archaic torso of Apollo, that is always in the presence of change. We need that in these days. We need that spiritual or interior vitality. And Rilke, I think, is a poet who can help us immensely along that way. But it will be discovering things already recognized, but not yet fully encountered, not yet fully, to use his word, experienced. And of course, once one enters into the experience of reading, encountering a Rilke poem, what one finds is that the poem begins to read one's own life, or at least this is my experience. That I feel as if the poem is starting to shape something within me. I'd like to end, if I might, with a poem that Rilke used as the preface, really, to the book of images or the book of pictures, variously translated. Das Buch der Bilder is the German title of a multi-volume set of poems. And it begins like this. Whoever you are, when evening falls, leave your little room where you know everything. For your house stands on the verge of distances, whoever you are. With your eyes so tired they can barely free themselves from the worn-out sill, lift with measured pace a single black tree and place it before the skies, slender and alone. And you have made the world, and it is vast, and like a word still ripening in the silences. And just as your will grasps its meaning, your eyes tenderly let it go. Whoever you are. That poem, to me, says it all. We live in a culture that wants to control everything. Donald Trump is the most vulgar and obscene expression of that, but it finds so many forms in our time. The controlling of others, the controlling of oneself. And here Rilke suggests that in a sense, that is death. That's the end of our lives, that our task, our vocation is to leave the place where we know everything and realize that where we are is at the edge of distances, of immensities, of vastnesses. And the only way we'll find that is to stop our frenetic moving, stop our frenetic controlling, and allow our life to shape our experience, and to allow our experience to shape our life, like a word still ripening in the silence. That would be the gift, I think, that Rilke's poetry will continue to offer to new generations of readers who still have the hunger and the curiosity and the courage to stay put and to go deep.
Well, we'll end on that note. I will link to your university page. Anyone who wants to contact you can do so there by clicking below this video. So thank you, Mark Burrows, for speaking about Rainer Maria Rilke.
Dan, it's been a pleasure, and good wishes to you. Happy reading. Good reading.
Vor dem Sommerregen, Rainer Maria Rilke. Auf einmal ist aus allem Grün im Park. Man weiß nicht was, etwas, fortgenommen man fühlt näher an die Fenster kommen und schweigsam sein. Inständig nur und stark, tont aus dem Gehölz die Regenpfeife, man denkt, in einem Hereinnemes, so sehr steigt, irgend Einsamkeit und Eifer aus dieser einem Stimme, die der Guss erhornt wird. Des Saales Wände sind, mit ihren Bildern von uns Vergötterten aus dürften sie nicht hören, was wir sagen. Es spiegeln die verblickenen Tapeten das ungewisse Licht von Nachmittagen, in denen man sich fürchtete als Kind. Before Summer Rain by Rainer Maria Rilke. Translation by Edward Snow. Suddenly, from all the green around you, something, you don't know what, has disappeared. You feel it creeping closer to the window in total silence. From the nearby wood, you hear the urgent whistling of a plover, reminding you of someone St. Jerome. So much solitude and passion come from that one voice whose fierce request the downpour will grant. The walls, with their ancient portraits, glide away from us cautiously, as though they weren't supposed to hear what we are saying. And reflected on the faded tapestries now, the chill, uncertain sunlight of those long childhood hours when you were so afraid.